For 9 days in May of 1926, Britain just stopped. The country held its breath during an incredible moment of industrial conflict, one that pitted millions of workers against the government. It had never happened before, and, well, it's never happened since. So today, we're going to dig into how it all went down, why it happened, and what kind of legacy it left behind.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start by setting the scene in the post-war tinderbox of 1920s Britain. Then we'll look at the one economic decision that really lit the fuse. We'll follow the tense countdown to the strike itself, and then we'll walk through those incredible 9 days. And finally, we'll unpack the lasting impact the strike had on the whole country.
Right, so to really get the strike, you first have to understand the 1920s. Britain was just exhausted from the First World War, it was facing huge economic problems, and there was this constant, simmering unrest in its industries. The whole country was basically a tinderbox just waiting for a spark.
And this table right here really shows you the scale of what was going on. Just look at that number for 1926. Over 162 million working days lost. I mean, it's not just a spike, it's an explosion. It's totally off the charts compared to the years around it. This tells you that this wasn't just another strike. This was something else entirely. This was the public plea from the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. And by all accounts, he really did want peace. His goal was to bring the different social classes together. But, as we're about to see, despite these words, the policies his government put in place ended up leading to the biggest conflict of them all.
So what was the actual spark? What was the thing that finally set this whole tinderbox ablaze? Well, it wasn't a riot or a fiery speech. It all came down to a big financial decision made by the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, a guy you might have heard of, Winston Churchill.
Now here's the wild part. At the time, most people thought this was a great idea. It was seen as a way to get back to stability, back to Britain's pre-war strength. But nobody seemed to see the catastrophic consequences that were coming, especially for Britain's most important industry, coal.
Okay, to really understand why this one decision was so important, we need to quickly get our heads around what it actually was. So what on earth was the gold standard?
So here's the key thing. It basically meant that the value of the British pound was tied to a fixed amount of physical gold. The government couldn't just print more money whenever it wanted. It was seen as a symbol of economic discipline, a return to the good old days before the war messed everything up.
And this shows you the domino effect perfectly. First, Churchill put the pound back to its old high value. That immediately made British exports, especially coal, about 10% more expensive for anyone trying to buy them from abroad. And when sales started to tank, the mine owners looked for a way to cut their costs. And the first thing they looked at was the miners' pay packets.
All right, so this brings us to the really tense 9-month period just before the strike. The government managed to avoid a strike at first by offering a temporary subsidy, but that just paused the clock. And what's fascinating is how the two sides used that 9-month truce so differently.
You can see the whole thing escalating right here. The owners demand cuts, the government pays up to buy time. The unions called this Red Friday. A special commission is set up, but its final report doesn't really satisfy anyone. The owners then lock the miners out of the pits, and that's when the Trades Union Congress, or TUC, makes the call for a national strike to support them.
Now, the government, under Baldwin, was not messing around. They used those 9 months to prepare for a fight. They dusted off the Emergency Powers Act and set up a whole volunteer organization, the OMS, whose entire job was to keep the country running if and when a national strike happened.
But the TUC? Well, it was a totally different story. They were dangerously overconfident. They thought they'd already won on Red Friday and just assumed the government would back down again. It was a huge mistake. They basically just hoped for the best and made almost no real plans for what a national shutdown would actually look like.
And the very last chance for peace snapped over this one incident. Some printers refused to print a really aggressive anti-union article in a newspaper. The hardliners in the government pounced on this. They framed it as an attack on the free press and used it as an excuse to break off all talks. And that was it. The strike was on.
So, at 1 minute to midnight on May 3rd, 1926, it began. Trains stopped, the docks went silent, factories shut down. The entire country was plunged into the biggest crisis it would face at home between the two world wars.
The level of solidarity was just staggering. We're talking about almost 2 million workers who walked off the job, not for their own pay, but to support the 1 million miners who'd been locked out. It was a display of working-class unity that had never been seen before.
And this, right here, is the absolute heart of the conflict. you had two completely different ways of seeing it. The government immediately framed it as a constitutional crisis, a direct challenge to democracy itself. But the TUC insisted it was nothing like that. It was, in their view, just an industrial dispute about getting a fair wage for miners.
Sonley Baldwin was really clever here. He used the new technology of radio to speak directly to the nation. He came across as this calm, reasonable man who wasn't an enemy of the workers, but was simply defending the nation against an illegal threat. He won the battle for the airwaves.
The TUC tried to fight back with its own newspaper, desperately trying to get their message out that this wasn't about revolution, it was about wages. But a printed newspaper was no match for the power and speed of the radio. They were losing the battle for public opinion.
And then, just like that, it was over. The TUC leadership folded. The government's meticulous planning, the thousands of volunteers keeping things running, and the TUC's own lack of a clear plan, it was all too much. They were worried they were running out of money and losing control of the movement, so they surrendered without winning a single thing for the miners.
That unconditional surrender was a huge shock for the millions of people who had walked out. The consequences came fast, and they were severe. It completely reshaped the political landscape for decades to come.
And for the miners, the people this was all supposed to be about, well, the result was an absolute catastrophe. They felt abandoned, but they struggled on alone for another 7 miserable months. In the end, they were basically starved back to work, forced to accept even worse pay and longer hours than they'd been offered in the first place.
The TUC was completely humiliated, and their membership numbers plummeted. The defeat forced them to do a lot of soul-searching. The era of massive, confrontational strikes was over. Instead, a more moderate leadership took over, focusing on negotiation rather than all-out industrial war.
And you can bet the government moved quickly to make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. They passed the 1927 Trade Disputes Act, which made these kinds of sympathetic strikes illegal. They also changed the rules on union funding for the Labor Party, which hit their finances hard.
So this leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. The general strike was, without a doubt, a crushing defeat for the unions. But by showing the limits of what a strike could achieve, did it accidentally convince a whole generation of people that the real path to change wasn't on the picket line, but through winning elections and gaining power in parliament?